get through the ethics material, or the rest of the ethics material, the stub material, and then we can move on into the quant method stuff as the video series progresses. So good luck. Let's just dive in. Let's take a quick review of the code, and then we can go and look at the standards. So what about the code of ethics? Well, the code of ethics starts by simply saying act in an ethical manner. So there's 6 parts to the code, and the first one is by far the most broad. It says to act with integrity, competence, diligence, respect, and in an ethical manner when you deal with anyone in a professional setting. That is, you're the public, clients, prospects, employers, employees, colleagues. So we are supposed to act in an ethical manner. So the first thing we learn out of the code of ethics is that we're supposed to be ethical. Okay? The next 5 parts of this 6-part code deal with what I would call sort of sub-areas, and you will see all 6 parts, but in particular the parts 2 through 6, echoed in the code, in the standards of professional conduct as we go through. So the first one says act in an ethical manner. The second one talks about the interest of clients. So integrity of the investment profession, for one, and in particular clients' interests, which this is a great big deal, and we're going to see this over and over again. The client's interests come before personal interest. So integrity is paramount, and client's interest always comes first. Now, it doesn't matter what else happens, okay? And when we're talking about the ethics material and the testing of ethics material, clients always come first. Now, we'll be able to establish something of a hierarchy as we go through, okay? But it's always going to be clients on the top and you on the bottom. So you can argue about the middle a little bit, but that's always going to be the case. What about part 3? So reasonable care, independent professional judgment when conducting analysis and making recommendations, taking investment actions, basically any of your professional activities. Okay, well these first 2 things, to have reasonable care and exercise independent professional judgment, are 2 of the Andy's slimmed down code of ethics. So when I read the code of ethics, there's lots of things going on. Okay, but I see 3 pillars plus a caveat is the way I describe it. 3 pillars and a caveat. The first pillar is independence and loyalty. Okay, so you need to be independent and you've got to be loyal. That's number 1. Second, reasonable care, a reasonable basis and diligence. So that's going to be followed up by the reasonable care stuff that you see here. And the third one we'll get to later in the caveat. But this is a big statement. Reasonable care, independent judgment. Well, that's 2 of my 3 pillars there in 1 bullet point. Part 4, practice and encourage others into practice in a professional or an ethical manner. This is something I've always enjoyed about the ethics material. In fact, I am a big proponent. This was something that somebody in our discipline needed to do. CFAI stepped up. I think they've done a very admirable job with this material. That's not to say that you're going to enjoy studying it. It is somewhat on the dry side, but it's very well thought out. But I thought this was great. So what we're going to see a couple of times is, yes, we're supposed to be ethical, and we're supposed to maintain and improve our skills, but as part of our responsibility to our profession, we're supposed to also encourage those around us. So we're supposed to practice in an ethical manner. Okay? We're supposed to encourage those around us to practice in a manner that will reflect credit on ourselves and on our profession. So be a credit to the investment profession is the way to think of that. Part 5 is to promote the integrity and uphold the rules governing the capital markets. Now, we're working here in the ethics book that was issued in 2010. This was something that was, when I was studying the Code of Ethics and taking the exams, this didn't have its own plank in the Code of Ethics. So this idea that we were responsible for promoting the integrity and upholding the rules governing the capital markets, obviously a big deal, because in our industry, if the investing public were to lose faith in the capital markets, well, our discipline would be of very little use to investors, right? So anyway, remember the markets and the integrity of the markets is going to be important, and we'll be able to talk about a hierarchy here as we go through the standards of professional conduct. And finally, once you receive your CFA charter, are you done? Well, no, because you have to maintain your professional competence, but you also have to improve your professional competence and strive to do the same for other professionals around you. So once again, we see that you have responsibilities to yourself, maintain and improve, and encourage those around you to do the same. Now, these 6 ideas in the Code of Ethics, I think we could all agree, if everyone would live by those, this would be a great world, and it would certainly constitute a poetic statement of what would be entailed in ethical behavior. But I don't think the Code of Ethics is really the point where the rubber meets the road when we are studying for the ethics portion of the exam. So it's certainly testable. I didn't say you didn't need to know that, but I think what you see here in front of you is in fact the material that is the most testable and at least the most problematic for the candidate that's getting ready for one of the exams. So what we've done here is we've taken this the idea of professional conduct and broke it down into 7 areas. In the way I view the world, we're going to have 6 of those that are fundamental, meaning they're based in economics or they're based in some sort of moral law or ethical standards generally. In other words, everyone can probably be held to the standards that are espoused here in parts 1 through 6. The last one down here, this is something that you take upon yourself by becoming a member of the CFA Institute or, in your case, at the very minimum, being a CFA candidate. So that has some unique ethical responsibilities that come with it. So we have 6 that I would call fundamental and 1 that is specific to the group that we have here, that is members of CFAI or candidates or charter holders, those types of people. Now, of these 6 fundamentals, are all of them created equal? Well, they're all important and they all contain testable material, but I think that they are not all equally important. In fact, I think that if you asked yourself, what is it that we're trying to do with the code and standards? What is the thing we most want to avoid? You would say that we most want to avoid cheating clients or dealing in an unethical manner with clients. And I think as we go through, you'll see that part 3 has lots of testable material, and therefore I think it merits a little extra study as you go through. Now, if you wanted to say, well, what other ones would you look at? Well, then 4 and 5 would be the ones that I would recommend that you spend a little extra time with. But this number 3 here, well, that's going to be one that I think you have to pay special attention to as you go through. So this would be a great point to have good stories and be able to give humorous anecdotes. Unfortunately, those are few and far between when you're talking about the ethics material, so we don't have any choice but to jump in and simply go through each of these standards one by one. And of course, the problem you recall from level 1 is that they each have subparts, and under those we got to talk about the standard itself, then we have to talk about some guidance for living the standard, and then there's also, for almost all the subparts, there's some recommended procedures that come with that we need to review for each of these cases. So we'll start, not surprisingly, with standard 1 that deals with professionalism. So let's just, the only solution I know to getting through this is to push on. So let's just put our nose to the grindstone, so to speak, and move on through the material. So first of all, when we're talking about standard 1A, these are our standards regarding knowledge of the law, and the point associated with this is that we have to understand and comply with all laws, rules, and regulations, and that includes the code and standards of any government, regulatory agency, or association governing professional activities. So we have to understand and comply with all these laws. However, sometimes you're working in multiple jurisdictions. So you've got someone who lives in the UK, they're doing business in Italy, they are CFA charter holder, so they have this U.S. organization that's developed this ethics material. Well, what happens if there are conflicts or there are different statements about what has to be done? Well, the rule is to always comply with the more strict law, rule, or regulation. So as a quick example, there are situations in some countries where you can trade on inside information. Then there's a bunch of rules about how you can do that and when it's legal and all those types of things. But even if you operate in a country that said that would be okay, well, the code and standards say if you have material, non-public information, then you cannot trade. So in that case, the code would be more strict. So you would have to live up to the code as we see it here, the code and standards. On the other hand, the code and standards suggest, this is actually a recommendation, that you maintain records for 7 years. Well, what if you live in a jurisdiction that requires you to keep records for 20 years? Well, then of course you live to the more strict standard and keep your records for 20 years. So always comply with the more strict standard, and you can't knowingly assist in a violation. Okay, if that's going on, you're going to have to take some sort of action, which may include the dissociating from the activity itself. All right, so that is the standard. Now let's talk about guidance. So when we have guidance, we're talking about knowledge of the law still. Well, we've already discussed this idea that we are supposed to comply with the most strict standard. So we've got to identify what that is, and of course we have to know what the various standards are in order to do that. If there's a violation, we need to notify somebody, the supervisor or a compliance officer, something like that. It may be that we want to confront the wrongdoer. That's not actually required, but under some circumstances that may be the way to handle it. Now this one is sometimes a big deal. Okay, what about dissociative necessary? So imagine yourself working in a 3 or 4 person shop. You're the new person there, and after you've been there for a while, you notice that there's some sort of unethical behavior going on. You bring that up with whoever is in charge of compliance or whatever happens, whoever it happens to be, and they tell you that, well, we don't see it that way and we're going to keep doing what we're doing because we're making lots of money. Okay? If you can't change it, in the limit, it may be necessary for you to dissociate by resigning your position. Yes, that has negative implications for your career and for your family, but you don't do something that's wrong just because there are negative implications if you're not participating. So dissociation in the limit may require you to go out and find a new job. Why? Because inaction can be construed as participation. Now there's a caveat down here. There's no requirement in the code for you to report violations to the governmental authorities. So if there's something going on, it's not only unethical, it's illegal. Do you have to report that? No, you don't, but it may be appropriate in some cases, and you're going to have to use good judgment when it comes to that. So that's the standard. Here's the guidance. Let's move on and talk about recommended procedures. So recommended procedures, what do we have to do? Well, of course, if we're going to live up to the code and the laws and all those sort of things, then we're going to have to keep informed. We're going to review regularly the written compliance procedures, maintain files, all that sort of stuff. Okay, let's seek advice when we need it. One of the things that comes through in the ethics material, in particular at level 2, you didn't see quite as much as level 1, is the idea that we are ethically obligated to go obtain expertise either by learning something ourselves or getting an expert if we need to, and this would be more evidence of that. And we need to encourage firms to adopt a code of ethics. If you operate in the developed world somewhere, then the firm you work for probably already has a code of ethics. But if it doesn't, then you should be in the business of encouraging those firms to adopt a code. And that is our first chunk of the standards of professional conduct. So we're done with 1A, and now we're ready to move on to, did I say that right? So we still have some more recommended procedures. There's 2 slides on this. Tripped me up. So anyway, recommended procedures, I forgot about this one. So distribute information internally. So this is going to be something else you're going to have to do if you have applicable laws and regulations. Okay, well, of course, we're going to have written procedures for reporting suspected violations. So we'll see some more of this when we get to the responsibilities of supervisors. Okay, but we have to have some mechanism for reporting violations. And members are strongly encouraged to report violations by other members. So if you see someone doing something wrong, you are encouraged to distribute that. Now we're done with 1A, and this better say 1B. Good. So we're now ready to move on to 1B. So we've got our first chunk down. Then it's just that simple. We'll talk about each subpart. We'll talk about the standard. We'll talk about the guidance. We'll review some recommended procedures, and then we'll move on. And that's the only way to get through this, unfortunately. All right, so independence and objectivity. We're going to see some more on this in a little while, and we're going to call it loyalty, because here we're establishing independent judgment. Loyalty is going to be how we execute this independent judgment. I put those two together as one of my pillars. So independence, loyalty, that's my first pillar of the ethics material, and this is probably the primary statement of that. So we need to use reasonable care and judgment to achieve and maintain independence in our professional activities. So what does that mean? Well, in finance, we are going to have responsibilities that go beyond the responsibility of a normal market transaction. That is, you can, and I think that one of the best ways to conceptualize a question on the exam, and this is a trick that I've used successfully, it's not really a trick, it is a device, maybe is a better way to put that, and that's to look at the question that's being asked, but instead of whatever the scenario that they're spinning in the question, think of it as a money manager working with an unsophisticated client. So that sort of hones the idea of what is ethical and what is not ethical. Can this money manager do that and not be abusing an unsophisticated client? Well, if that's the case, that sometimes crystallizes the idea. But think of it this way. So what we're doing is we are a money manager. We're working for an unsophisticated client. What we have to do is make sure that our decision making is not tainted by our other relationships. So we've got this client out there. We're going to be independent and objective, but we also have a investment banking function in our shop, and we also know the brokers that execute the trades, and we also have all these other things going on, and we serve on boards of different companies or whatever it happens to be. Okay, we have to maintain or take reasonable care to maintain our independence so that we are clear to make decisions without having some sort of taint from our other activities, so we can focus on the problems of our clients. So we can't offer, solicit, or accept any compensation that would compromise our independence or our objectivity. Okay, that's the standard. What about guidance? So the guidance here, what about modest gifts? So there were previous editions of the ethics material that actually had a de minimis rule that said, if there's something that's worth less than $100, well, people probably won't, lie, cheat, and steal too much for a $100 gift. But just think of this as modest. So if someone gives you a fountain pen that says, Charlie's Brokerage on it, that's not the same as necessarily that won't necessarily mean that your independence has been tainted. Okay? So what about this idea of distinguishing between gifts from clients and gifts from entities trying to influence a member's behavior? This is a key portion of what we're trying to accomplish here. So think of it this way. Here I am. I'm a money manager. I'm working with my unsophisticated client. Okay, I have discretionary authority over their portfolio. I'm doing some buying and selling. In order to do that, I have to hire a broker to actually execute the trades. Okay, well, if the client comes to me and says, hey, if you can beat the market by 50 basis points next quarter, then you can use the condo in Vail for a weekend. Well, that would be a gift from a client. That is not specifically prohibited under the code and standards. Now, we got to get to the third bullet point here and talk about it for some more, but gifts from clients are not specifically prohibited because they fall along the lines of the fiduciary responsibility. So they're not tainting, in other words. However, the broker over here that's executing the trades, if they came to us and said, hey, why don't you use the condo in Vail for a weekend? Well, what are they trying to do? They may be trying to influence our behavior as to where we direct trades. So that's someone who could be trying to taint our independence by garnering favor or influence in our decision making. Okay, there's a difference between the client and the broker in that example. We need to be able to distinguish between the two. Gifts from clients are not specifically prohibited. However, if we receive a gift from a client, we have to disclose that to our employer and get permission to receive the gift if it's associated with future performance. So if the client came to us and said, hey, you did a great job last quarter, use the condo, that's one thing. We have to disclose that, but we'd also, if they said, hey, if you beat the market by 50 basis points next quarter, then we would have to get permission from the employer and, of course, disclose as part of that. So that is the independence and objectivity. We've got a little more guidance on this. So members responsible for hiring outside managers shouldn't accept travel or gifts or entertainment that can impair their objectivity. So if you are, putting together a portfolio of portfolio managers, okay, well, you can't have them wining you, dining you, and taking you to expensive resorts and all that sort of stuff. That will obviously impair your objectivity. Okay, what about investment banking relationships? I think this is a big deal. Of course, we have the notion and another way to think of this, or the questions involved in the exam. Well, I already told you my money manager and unsophisticated investor. The other scenario I use in my mind when I'm reviewing the questions is, let's think of this from the point of view of someone who works in the research department. So what happens when the investment banker comes over and says, hey, we're trying to get some investment banking business with this company, but we really need a good recommendation on their stock in order to push us over the top in closing this deal. Well, if you gave into that, in other words, you were kind of marginal as to whether or not this was going to be something you'd issue a buy recommendation on, but in order to help out the investment banking side, you would be bowing to pressure, okay, and that is a violation of your independence. Okay, also, finally, for issuer paid research here, well, I guess not finally, but issuer paid research, a flat fee structure is preferred. Why? Because we don't want to work on a commission basis. We want to be paid for our services, make our recommendations, and then we disclose the fact that we were paid, and it's all over. So we don't have any contingent compensation based on what decisions we make. Okay, so some more guidance here to finish out this, then we can talk about some recommendations. Okay, members working for credit rating firms should avoid influence by issuing firms. This, of course, is something that has new prominence in the ethics material, and very likely you could associate that with the problems that occurred shortly before the issuance of the 2010 version of the ethics book, that being the 2008 financial meltdown, and of course the credit rating firms took some heat in that process. So users of credit ratings should be aware that there's a potential conflict there. You've got the raters, you've got the issuers. Okay, they are going to be talking to one another. Okay, so that's going to be something important to remember. Best practices for analysts is to pay for their own commercial travel when they are going to analyze firms or go to firm events. So if you got an analyst going out to review facilities or to a firm event, it's best if the analysts pay for their own travel. What about recommended procedures? And so recommended procedures here, again, remember the point is we've got to maintain independence and objectivity. So we have to protect the integrity of our opinions. Reports, of course, should reflect our unbiased opinions. That's what we mean by independent and objective. We ought to have a restricted list, what we can comment on, what we can buy and sell to avoid any temptation of evil. We ought to restrict special cost arrangements in terms of research output. We ought to limit gifts, and we ought to have clear value limits that are established by the firm. And something we're going to see in a number of places is this idea of IPO shares. Anytime you see IPO shares and allocations, think of this in terms of the typical hot or underpriced IPO. Everybody wants those shares. How are you going to get them allocated to your clients' portfolios? Well, we need to do it in an objective fashion, and we're going to be able to say some more about that as we progress through the material. So this is a number of things going on here, but basically the idea is we have to protect the integrity of our opinions, and as a sort of an overarching consideration when you're reviewing any question on the exam with respect to ethics, remember that what we're looking for is in many cases is intent. In particular, if there is intent to deceive. So if somebody is trying to say things just right to avoid, they're making a disclosure, but they're trying to use very careful language and they're not using the word that would be obvious, and anyway, their intent is to be less than transparent, then there is going to be a violation, and probably because there is some sort of breach of their independence. Okay? All right, so that's standard 1B. Let's move on and talk about standard 1C, which is misrepresentation. Surprisingly enough, ethical behavior does not include lying, is basically what this says. So you can't make misrepresentations, that is lie, about matters relating to your investment analysis, your recommendations, your actions, or basically any professional activities. So anything you do in your professional activities, you've got to make sure that you are not misrepresenting yourself either by being overly technical or, pushing it down into the footnotes. Okay, what you'll see as we go through is there's going to be an emphasis on effective disclosure in plain language in a couple of places that I think is a welcome addition to the ethics material a couple of generations back in the ethics manual. What about guidance here? Hey, so guidance, remember, this doesn't just cover written communications. Also, if you're emailing or if you're just talking, you're talking on the phone, you're giving a report, okay, you can't misrepresent yourself. You can't misrepresent the qualifications of the firm or the services the firm can provide or your own qualifications to do the job. Of course, in most developed economies, we already have laws against this, but you can't guarantee a certain rate of return. And we also have this no plagiarism rule. Okay, so if you are using somebody else's work, just like when you were in English class as an undergraduate, if you're using someone else's work, it can be written, it can be oral, it could have been electronic communication. You have to give proper attribution for that. And if you don't, of course, that's going to become a problem. We are going to have one caveat to this on the next slide that you can keep in mind as we go through. So recommended procedures here. So looking at this, we can see that the firm can assist the employees by providing a written list of their available services. So if the employees know what it is the firm can do, they're less likely to misrepresent the firm's qualifications or the services that they provide. Okay, what about this plagiarism thing? Well, remember, we just said if you're using other people's work, then you have to cite that. It's fine to use third-party research. We'll have a little more to say about it later, but that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. But you have to cite it, so it's got to be properly attributed. Okay, there is, however, an exception to that, and that's when you're using recognized financial and statistical reports. Bloomberg. Why? Because they're a recognized financial and or statistical reporting service. So there is that one caveat to the plagiarism thing. Other than that, you'll need to cite. Okay, so continuing with this or finishing up this misrepresentation stuff, okay, the models and analysis that we use from others, okay, have to have attribution. That, of course, makes sense. Then should encourage the firm to establish procedures for verifying marketing claims of third parties recommended to clients. So if you've got a firm out there that another firm that is saying they can accomplish X, and you're going to recommend that firm, well, then you probably need to have some system in place to verify whether their claims actually have any truth behind them. And that's 1C, which brings us to the famous 1D, which is also called, in my lingo, the mommy rule. And what this basically says is don't do anything that would make your mommy ashamed of you. So don't engage in any professional conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or commit any act that reflects adversely on your professional reputation, integrity, competence, or your upbringing. So this is the mommy rule, and what you would see very likely is that any particular breach in the exam is likely to constitute a breach of multiple parts of the ethics material. So if you have someone who's doing something where they're misrepresenting, well, then obviously they're in violation of standard 1C on misrepresentation. That's also misconduct 1D. And if their supervisor wasn't doing everything he could to prevent and detect or she could to prevent and detect the problem to begin with, well, that could be a violation too. So there could actually be 3 violations associated with one misrepresentation or one act on the exam. So be careful of things that would involve multiple ethical breaches. Now, what about the guidance associated with this? Just remember that this standard covers things that are not only unethical, or excuse me, not only illegal, but would also be unethical. So the notion here is we have a legal standard, but ethics is supposed to be greater than that. So we're not striving for legal behavior, we're striving for ethical behavior. So this would cover, anything that may not be illegal, but would still adversely affect the member's ability to perform duties, their reputation, the reputation of the designation, all those types of things. Okay, so recommended procedures here. Well, of course, we ought to adopt a code of ethics to which all employees must adhere. Most big firms, of course, would already have that in place. We ought to disseminate a list of potential violations and associated disciplinary sanctions. Okay, well, that is certainly something that should exist. And then we should do some common sense things like conduct background checks and on potential employees and look for good character and those types of things. All right, so let me ask you a quick question here. So if we are reading a question on the exam and it sets up a scenario where we have a firm that has done something or the firm that is wondering about their ethics policy, and they disseminate a list of potential violations, but the list does not have any disciplinary sanctions associated with it. Are they in violation of the code and standards? Okay, well, this is something that is tricky, but something that you're going to have to be prepared to deal with. And the answer is no, they're not. Well, it says right there they're supposed to have a list of associated disciplinary sanctions. Okay, but remember, this comes off the recommended procedures, right? So the guidance, you can assume that is required for the most part, but recommended procedures are just that. So if we don't see this anywhere else in terms of having a list of associated disciplinary sanctions, if that's not part of the standard somewhere else, then that would just be a recommendation, and technically you wouldn't be in violation of the code, and you would have to be very careful with that on the exam. So you have to read these questions very, very carefully is the point of that. Okay, well, good news. Remember, we started out going through these 7 different standards, okay, but we've got one of them down, so there's only 6 more to go because we're here to standard 2, the integrity of the capital markets. And you'll see that this one might go just a little bit faster, so that's a good thing. So integrity of the capital markets, this was something that existed in the if you go back a couple of generations in the ethics material, but it got its own standard, I don't know, some time ago now, but it's been this way in a couple of generations of the book, but nonetheless, there's a renewed emphasis on the fact that we are responsible for upholding the integrity of the capital markets. If the integrity of the capital markets crumbles, then our discipline crumbles also, so it's in our own best interest. Okay, let's start off talking about material, non-public information. 2 words there. Material, we have to worry about what that means, and non-public, we have to worry about a little bit about what that means. We'll see that as we go through the guidance and then a little more on the recommended procedures. So what's the point here, though? Members in possession of non-public information that could affect an investment's value must not act or cause someone else to act on that information. So while there are certainly circumstances in developed economies where possession of material non-public information or trading on material non-public information would not constitute illegal activity, at least under some circumstances. And what those are is not important to the exam. But there are countries where if you have material non-public information under some circumstances, and those circumstances usually revolve around how you came to possess that information, but under some circumstances you could trade. But surprise, if you operate in one of those jurisdictions, okay, and you've signed up to be part of CFAI, well, now you have a complete trading prohibition under those scenarios. So if you possess material non-public information, you can't trade, you can't cause anyone else to trade. Basically, you have to behave in the same manner you would if you did not have that information in place. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, material, okay, that's a word that you've got to be a little careful with, and you'll see why in a few minutes because we're going to talk about non-material, non-public information. But material means that if the disclosure of the information would affect the security's price, or if an investor would want to know this information before making an investment decision, then it is material. So this creates a scenario where lots of information would be material. So you can think of this as sort of a low threshold for materiality. 1, it affects securities price. Well, everyone would probably argue that that is material information. But even if it wouldn't affect price, the typical investor would still want to know then it is material information. Now there is a caveat here, and that is if the price effect is ambiguous, then the information may not be considered material. Okay, and this is going to extend to information such as upcoming ratings changes, which would be a great example for the exam. We've got an influential analyst that's about to release that, those types of things. You come to know about it. Okay, well, anyway, you wouldn't be able to trade on it unless, of course, we had this one caveat where the price effect was ambiguous. So we got to be a little bit careful with that. Okay, so what about some more guidance here, continuing on? So here, what does non-public mean? So we talked about what material means. What is non-public? Well, something is non-public until it has been made available to the marketplace. Well, what does it mean to be made available to the marketplace? Well, I don't know exactly what that means, but I know what what is not included in that, and that's information that is made available just to analysts. So if you go to a meeting of analysts with the corporate management and they say, hey, well, on Friday of this week, we're going to announce that earnings were below expectations by 7 cents, okay, or something along those lines. Well, they just announced it to a room full of analysts. Is that now public information? Specifically under the code and standards, no, it's not. Until they announce it in a general public forum that was not just invited analysts, then it is going to be still going to be non-public, and you still can't trade on it. Okay, what does it mean to act? Okay, well, that means that for yourself or any related transaction, it also includes related securities such as swaps and options and those types of things. So we're going to have to be careful with all that. Some more guidance. So if you possess material non-public information, what you have to do is act as if you didn't have the information at all. So you've got to pretend in your mind, okay, I don't know that. How would I act in the absence of that? Now, an important caveat, and that is this idea of the mosaic theory. So what this says is if you combine non-material, non-public information along with public information, and you come to a conclusion, and that conclusion represents some superior insight, then you can trade on it. That is not a violation. So the story I tell in association with this is you're an analyst, you follow some industry, you know the firms in that industry very well, you know their strengths and weaknesses, you already have all that, it's all public information, it's all out there, you work with it every day. But then one day you're going to lunch, and you see the CEOs of two of these firms eating lunch over in the corner, and they're talking and they have this conversation. It looks really serious, and you start thinking, wow, those two firms have complementary resources, okay, complementary market space, geographic distribution, whatever it is. They would be great merger candidates. So you've taken this non-material, non-public information, that is, you saw two guys having lunch together, along with your public knowledge about what those firms look like. You put that together and you say, those would be great merger candidates if they ever were to hold up together. So I'm going to behave as if this is a merger that's going forward. Well, that would be analysis that would fall under the mosaic theory, and that is not illegal. So the purpose of all this is not to forbid superior analysis. So if you've got superior analysis, you can come to better conclusions than everybody else. Well, go out and make lots of money. That's what we want. So that's the mosaic theory. Be aware of that. Okay, let's go on now to recommendations. Okay, so recommended procedures here. Okay, of course, if you work in the industry, at least in the United States, you're very familiar with the idea of the firewall. What we're going to try to do is we're going to try to build information barriers between different operational units. And again, the best way to conceptualize this is an information barrier between research and between investment banking. So you don't want the investment bankers who possess lots of sensitive inside information leaking over what's going on in research or having influence there. So we're going to try to control those interdepartmental communications. Okay, the information barrier probably would include a restricted list, that is lists of securities that you can't trade on, and you're probably going to want to review employee trades because that's going to be, if you have an employee that always trades, always buys a day or two ahead of all the strong buy recommendations and sells a day or two ahead of the strong sell recommendations, well then that's evidence that you might have a problem somewhere with leaking information, right? So you can safeguard that by reviewing employee trades. Okay, some more recommended procedures here. And so we want to increase review while the firm is in possession of material non-public information. So while we have this sensitive information, we want to know if our employees are trading in the firms that would be affected by it. So we've got material non-public information. We want to be very careful in how we handle that is the point. What about standard 2B, okay, which is market manipulation here? So what are we saying? This is very straightforward, and really there's only two things you have to know here. But the standard itself says we can't engage in practices that distort price or that artificially inflate trading volume with the intent to mislead the market. Notice the red line under intent there. So we can't do things that are going to distort price, and we can't do things that are going to distort volume. So if you have a firm that says, hey, we're going to go out and do guarantee a certain amount of volume in a new security in order to get things going, well, that is artificially giving the impression of volume. So you can't do that even if it would have no impact on price. Okay, and in terms of guidance here, and this is all we have for this standard 2B, we're not to engage in transaction-based manipulation. That is, give false impressions of activity or price movement. Of course, you can't, gain a dominant position in an asset class for the specific purpose of manipulating the price of the asset or the related derivative. And of course, we don't want to distribute false or misleading information. This, of course, would hurt the market. It would also be a violation of the misrepresentation standards. So standard 2B on market manipulation, the primary things that I want you to remember there are that this refers to not only things that would manipulate price, but also those things that would create the appearance of more volume than actually exists in the trading of the underlying security.